What if I told you that some people think holding hands with someone outside of your relationship is worse than sending naked photos? And some people feel like an emotional affair is much worse than a physical one. And these gray areas can make or break your relationship, especially if there's infidelity. I'm Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon, and today we're talking about sexual, emotional, and physical behaviors to look at which ones people actually consider cheating. Well, why does this even matter? Well, we often assume that everyone has the same definition of cheating. And it seems preposterous to us when our partners or friends do actions that we consider as cheating, but they actually don't think is a big deal. Ultimately, these differences in perception of what is cheating can destroy relationships when partners have very different boundaries that they've never talked about. And mostly everyone agrees that obviously sexual intercourse with someone else is cheating. But there's far less agreement on more ambiguous behaviors like holding hands, sharing secrets, or going to dinner alone with someone of the opposite sex. Now, these gray areas are where most relationship conflicts actually happen. And as someone who works primarily with a lot of men, I can imagine how this could lead to a lot of conflicts if you don't talk about this with your partner. But before I explain the science, since you're already here, investing time in learning about improving your relationships, why not grab my free guide that covers the top 10 things that actually enhance pleasure, backed by science, at www.renamalikmd.com/morepleasure. Back to the science. So to figure out what people generally think of cheating as, a team of researchers from the University of Michigan and a bunch of other institutions studied this exact question. They surveyed 456 college students, about 67% were women, and on average they were 19 years old. And they looked at 27 different behaviors to see whether these constituted cheating in a long-term relationship. In the study, the researchers created this list of 27 behaviors which spanned a number of different categories. Things like sexual behaviors, which included intercourse or oral sex, erotic behaviors like texting sexual messages or watching porn together, relationship status behaviors, sort of like holding hands or kissing, emotional bonding, like forming deep connections or sharing secrets, financial support, such as giving someone even $5 to support them financially, and social interactions like brief hugs or taking road trips together. Now, each participant rated every behavior on a scale from 0 to 100%, meaning that 0 was like there's no cheating and 100% is definitely cheating if it was done with someone of the opposite sex other than their partner. But here's what makes this study really interesting. They also measured two key personality traits: attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. Attachment anxiety is essentially a fear of abandonment, like these people are constantly worrying about losing their partner. Whereas attachment avoidance is sort of the opposite. These people tend to keep a real emotional distance and avoid intimacy. And I talked all about these sort of attachment styles with Jessica Baum on the podcast very recently, and it was so fascinating to see how these actually play out in relationships. So if you want to learn more about these attachment styles, check out that podcast with Jessica Baum. So in this study, the researchers looked at validated psychological scales to identify and measure the presence of these traits. And then they tried to analyze basically how gender and attachment style influenced how they perceived these behaviors as cheating. So in terms of the results, some of these are really going to surprise you because they definitely surprised me. First, the obvious stuff that everyone mostly agrees on. Sexual behaviors like intercourse, oral sex, showering together, these were rated as cheating by 96 to 98% of participants. But here's where it gets interesting. Erotic behaviors that don't necessarily involve direct physical contact, like texting sexual messages or emailing naked photos, were still highly rated as cheating, but not ubiquitous. It was about 75 to 88%. Now, the next thing I'm going to tell you actually contradicted what researchers thought they would find. Women actually rated sexual and erotic behaviors as more indicative of cheating than men did, not less. And this goes against the thought that women only care about emotional affairs and traditional evolutionary psychology, which predicts that men would be more sensitive to sexual infidelity. Now, women also gave significantly higher cheating ratings to 10 different behaviors, and that included texting erotic messages, emailing naked pictures, watching pornographic movies together, holding hands, forming deep emotional bonds, which I think most people think that this is what women care about, and the only behavior that men rated higher was giving someone $5. Yeah, you heard that right. Men were more likely than women to see giving someone $5 as cheating. Now, this was obviously a minor financial support item, but it's still really interesting. And the psychology gets even more interesting when you look at attachment styles. People who had higher attachment anxiety, those who were afraid of abandonment, rated 18 out of 27 behaviors more indicative of cheating, meaning that they're really nervous and hypervigilant. So they think that these are all potential threats to their relationship. Whereas people who had attachment avoidance, those who kept emotional distance, showed the opposite pattern. They actually rated those sexual and erotic behaviors as less indicative of cheating. And this might be because those people are more likely to actually do those behaviors themselves when they're in relationships because they're avoiding sort of intimacy. And how intense the behavior was actually affected how likely someone called it cheating. For example, kissing on the lips was seen as more serious than kissing on the cheek. Giving someone $500 was rated much higher rather than giving someone $5. And hugging for more than 10 seconds was more serious than a brief hug. And sleeping in the same bed was worse than just staying in the same hotel room. And researchers call this like the signal strength effect. Basically, the stronger the signal of a romantic or sexual interest, the more likely people were to call it cheating. Now, finally, when they analyzed all the data, they came up with 3 clear categories. Obviously, sexual and erotic interactions. These were about 93% likely to be called cheating. And that was, again, intercourse to sexting. And both men and women rated these highly, although women rated them slightly higher. The next was close relationship behaviors, and this was 42% on the cheating scale. This included things like holding hands, going to dinner, sharing secrets, and providing financial support. And this is the gray area where most relationship conflicts happen. And not surprisingly, right? I can see how somebody could think that this is just a normal friendship and others would find this as being too close. And specifically, if you're with a partner who has attachment anxiety, they were more likely to rate close relationship behaviors much higher as cheating. And where more secure people saw this as normal friendship. And casual social interactions, only 11% of people thought this was cheating. So this is brief hugs, telling jokes, calling about work problems. The large majority of people don't see them as cheating. So what does this mean for you and your relationships? First, guys, have the conversation. Don't assume your partner shares what you think is cheating. And the ratings for cheating ranged anywhere from 9% to 98% depending on the behavior, which shows really there's a huge variation. And something that might seem really innocent to you might feel like a betrayal to your partner. Second, try to understand your and your partner's attachment style. If you are constantly worried about your partner's friendships or casual interactions, it might not be that you're controlling, you may have higher attachment anxiety. So it's important to realize it and be able to communicate about it rather than allowing it to create conflict. And lastly, consider how strong the signal is. Obviously the context and intensity matter enormously. A work dinner is very different from having a romantic dinner one-to-one, and a quick hug is different from a very long embrace. And lastly, recognize that there are obviously gender patterns. Guys, this is not new to you. Women in the study were more likely to identify various behaviors as cheating, not just emotional ones. Now, a little caveat, this study looked at American college students who were on average 19 years old. The results might have been different if they looked at older adults or those who were actually in long-term marriages or people with different cultural backgrounds. But the bottom line is cheating isn't black and white. It is sort of on a continuum, and where you draw the line depends on your gender, your attachment style, and your personal experiences. And behaviors that might seem obviously innocent to you might actually feel threatening to your partner. And it's not necessarily your fault or their fault. It's just that you have to have the conversation. So talk to your partner, figure out what is infidelity to you, or maybe go through these 27 behaviors and figure out which of them are sort of red flags to your partner. And if you care about your relationship and your sex life, make sure to subscribe because you'll learn everything you need to know about your body, sex life, relationships, and health right here on my channel. And as always, we're going to take care of yourself because you're worth it.